Man poisoned by wife dies and sees the afterlife. What he learns is horrifying. David awoke with a jolt, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. The suffocating darkness around him made it impossible to tell where he was, but his chest burned, the tightness in his lungs sending waves of panic through his already disoriented mind. He tried to lift his hand to his throat, but his body felt heavier than usual, sluggish and uncoordinated. The last thing he remembered was a meal, dinner with his wife, Emma. The taste of the wine still lingered in his mouth. The warmth, the comfort of their home. Then everything went black. His vision had blurred as his body gave way to a sickness, a deep, gnawing pain in his stomach. His final thoughts before his heart gave out had been of her, Emma, the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with everything. But now, that trust felt like a distant memory. The poison had worked faster than he could have ever anticipated, leaving him gasping for breath on the cold floor of his kitchen. And then silence. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his words lost to the void. Panic surged through him, but no matter how hard he willed his body to move, it remained still. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had it really been her? Had Emma really done this to him? She had always been so loving, so kind. But the look in her eyes as she served him dinner, something had been off. That distant glint in her gaze, that coldness he had never seen before. His heart stuttered at the thought. It couldn't be. It had to be some mistake. He tried again to move, to break free of the weight of his own body, but there was nothing. The pain in his chest intensified, and for the first time, David realized that he couldn't feel his heart beating. He couldn't feel anything. He was weightless, suspended in the air, or perhaps suspended in time. A cold breeze swept over him, and for the first time, he noticed a faint light in the distance, flickering like the weak glow of a candle. He focused on it, desperate to make sense of his surroundings. The air around him felt strange. It wasn't just cold, it was empty, hollow, like a vast void that stretched endlessly in all directions. The light grew stronger, drawing him toward it as if it were a magnet. Without thinking, without even questioning, he found himself moving toward it, his body floating through the dense blackness. The sensation was both freeing and terrifying, as though he were a mere fragment of something much larger. And then, as he neared the light, the world around him began to change. The light didn't blind him as it had before. Instead, it revealed a landscape he could never have imagined. The air was thick with a palpable energy, a buzz that vibrated deep within his bones. Everything around him was an eerie, otherworldly gray, empty, devoid of life, but somehow not completely devoid of presence. The land stretched out before him in a barren wasteland, devoid of color or form. The sky above him was nothing but a swirling mass of black and gray clouds that seemed to churn in a never-ending storm. He wasn't sure where he was, but it felt wrong, unnatural, as though he were standing on the precipice of something terrifying, something that defied the laws of life and death. As he looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, a voice echoed in his mind. It wasn't a sound he could hear with his ears, but something deeper, a voice that resonated with his very soul. "You've crossed over, David." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it carried a weight of authority. It wasn't human, but it didn't feel entirely malevolent either. It was as if it had existed before time itself, watching and waiting for him. David's heart quickened with a mix of fear and curiosity. Who are you? Where am I?" he thought, though he didn't know if he was speaking aloud or not. The words simply appeared in his mind, as if the very act of thinking them summoned a response. "This is the space between life and death." The voice responded, "This is where your soul now resides, David." David's mind reeled. The space between life and death? He could feel the weight of the words settle into his chest, an oppressive reality settling over him. He had died. He had actually died. He tried to move forward, to take another step, but it was as though the air had solidified around him, blocking his path. Panic rose again in his chest, and he struggled to breathe as his thoughts raced. How could this be happening? "You must come to terms with your choices, David, before you can move forward." The voice's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and ominous. Something about them felt wrong. He had choices? What choices? He had done nothing to deserve this, nothing to explain why he was here in this place. Was this some kind of punishment? The choices you made in life have consequences, David. The voice said, as though it were reading his mind, knowing exactly what he feared. You cannot escape your own actions. David's heart clenched as his mind raced back to Emma. Had she really done this? Had she poisoned him? The thought was unbearable. He had never suspected her of anything so horrific, so malicious. Yet, the more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit. The strange distance between them, the cold look in her eyes when she served him the drink. Had he been too blind to see the truth? Had he trusted her so completely that he failed to notice the signs? She poisoned me, didn't she? The words slipped out of his mouth before he could stop them, raw and desperate. The voice did not respond immediately. It was as though the question hung in the air, unanswered. And in that silence, David realized something horrifying, that he was not here for the reasons he had believed. The truth, he now understood, was something far darker than he could have imagined. David's chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air around him felt colder, as if the very place he was in was absorbing his fear, feeding off it. His breath came out in shallow, shaky gasps, his body trembling despite the eerie stillness of the world around him. The voice, the one that had told him he was in the space between life and death, hadn't responded to his desperate question. But the silence between the two of them was pregnant with something far worse than the unknown. It was filled with the sense that he was being watched. Watched by something far beyond him, something that understood his deepest fears, his darkest thoughts. You must face the truth, David. The voice finally spoke again, its tone as steady and unyielding as before. The lies you told yourself are gone now. You cannot hide from what you have done. David swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his throat tight with fear. What did it mean? What had he done? He had lived a normal life, had loved his wife, had trusted her. But now, the weight of the truth pressed down on him with suffocating force. The more he thought about the moments before his death, the more it seemed clear. His own thoughts turned against him, like the venom in his body, showing him things he didn't want to see. The night before he died, Emma had been different. Her smile hadn't been the same, the warmth in her eyes had faded into something more calculating. She had served him the wine, told him it was his favorite, but he hadn't noticed how she looked at him, how her hands trembled as she poured it. The way she had refused to join him for the meal. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind to her intentions? You still don't understand, do you? The voice whispered, cutting through his thoughts like a sharp knife. You think this is about her, about what she did. But it is not. David's mind reeled. He was sinking deeper into confusion, the words of the voice twisting into a knot in his chest. The blame, the anger, the sorrow, all of it was mixed together in a cloud that clouded his understanding. Was this truly about Emma? Or was there something else, something deeper, at play? He didn't know what to believe anymore. You were complicit in your own fate. The voice continued. The poison she gave you was not the only thing that killed you. His heart skipped a beat. Complicit? What did that mean? He wasn't the one who had poisoned himself, he hadn't. The words were there before he could stop them. They were buried deep, hidden in the recesses of his mind, but they were undeniable. He had seen the signs, the distance, the changes in Emma's behavior, the little lies she had told him over the years, the way she had manipulated him, controlled him, the growing rift between them. He had known something was wrong. He had let it fester, ignored it for far too long. He had been complicit in his own misery, in the unraveling of his marriage. He had ignored the warning signs. He had been blind to the cracks forming beneath the surface. You turned a blind eye when you should have seen, David. You failed to protect yourself. You failed to see the darkness growing in the woman you loved. The voice seemed to grow closer, a dark presence pressing in on him, as if it was trying to tear open the walls of his mind. He was suffocating. The truth was drowning him. He hadn't wanted to see it, hadn't wanted to face the reality that Emma had been slowly poisoning him, not just with the wine, but with the lies, with her coldness. He had ignored the emotional poison for years, and now it had manifested physically. She had taken him apart, piece by piece. But this wasn't just about Emma. You are part of a cycle, David. You're not the first to fall victim to this. The voice shifted again, its tone changing, as though something more ancient was speaking to him, something far older than he could comprehend. His thoughts spiraled in panic. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "What is this cycle? What are you talking about?" The shadows around him deepened, twisting into shapes that were impossible to understand. Figures, dark, formless figures, appeared at the edges of his vision. He could barely focus on them before they vanished, like fleeting shadows on the edge of his mind. But he could feel them, watching, waiting. "This is not just your story," the voice said, each word lingering like a curse. "There are many like you. Many who have turned away, ignored the darkness within their own lives, their own relationships. They too are complicit in their fates. You are not alone." David's mind reeled, his body trembling as he tried to piece together the meaning of the voice's cryptic words. He wasn't alone? What did that even mean? Was it trying to tell him that this was all some part of a larger pattern? Some greater force that had led him here? Had he been part of something he hadn't even known existed? The figures in the darkness began to move, circling him like vultures, waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to face the truth of his existence. He could feel their eyes on him, their presence oppressive and overwhelming. And yet, the deeper he fell into the void, the more it became clear. He was trapped. Trapped in his own mind, in the choices he had made, in the guilt that had consumed him. "You will not leave until you understand, David?" The voice echoed through the darkness, its power growing. "You will remain here until you confront your choices. Until you face the truth." David closed his eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming pressure. But the truth was unavoidable. It was breaking through the walls of his mind, tearing apart everything he thought he knew. He had been complicit, but it wasn't just Emma. It was him too. He had chosen to ignore the warning signs, to turn away when he should have seen the truth. And now, the reckoning had arrived. The question was no longer whether he would survive. It was whether he could ever escape the consequences of his own blindness. David's heart raced, his mind scrambling to make sense of the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. The voice was still there, reverberating through the very air he breathed, filling his thoughts with its terrible, weighty truth. The presence of the figures, the shadows that circled him like vultures, loomed ever closer. His skin prickled with the sensation that something unspeakable was about to happen, that the horrors of his situation were just beginning to unfold. "You will never leave, David, until you have confronted everything." The voice didn't feel human anymore. It was deeper, more primal, like a warning from an ancient being, an entity that existed long before mankind had ever walked the earth. David tried to shake his head, to refuse to believe the truth, but the pressure of it, of the weight of what had happened, only tightened around him. There was no escaping it. The truth had become a part of him, and it wasn't going to let him go. The space around him seemed to distort, the air growing heavier, more oppressive. He could still see nothing but darkness, but he could feel the presence of the shadows that seemed to reach out, brushing against his skin like cold hands. They whispered, their voices inaudible but unmistakably close, murmuring words he couldn't quite make out. Each whisper sent a cold shiver down his spine, his body shaking with the chill of fear. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" David's voice trembled as he tried to speak, to make sense of the chaos swirling around him. His throat burned, the dry air scratching at his vocal cords. His body felt foreign to him now, like it wasn't his own. He had no control over it, no control over his fate. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and when he looked down at them, they seemed to fade in and out of view, as though they didn't fully belong to him anymore. The shadows grew darker, closing in on him like a suffocating blanket. The oppressive silence that had followed the voice was now shattered by the faintest sound. Just a whisper, but one that carried with it the force of something far larger than David could ever comprehend. "You were chosen, David. Chosen to learn. Chosen to see." The voice sent a ripple through his entire being, his chest tightening with the weight of the words. Chosen to learn? Chosen for what? chosen to see the truth? But the truth was what had destroyed him. The truth was what had killed him. He had died because of a lie, Emma's betrayal, and now he was being punished for something he couldn't even understand. The figures, the shadows that had been circling him, began to materialize. Slowly, their forms took shape, becoming figures of darkness with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality itself. They were tall, hunched figures, their faces covered in deep shadows that obscured any features. They weren't human, not in the way that David understood. Their presence was unnatural, a nightmare made flesh, and their eyes were cold, filled with a hollow, judgmental fury. You have seen the end, David, but this is not the end of your story. This is the beginning. One of the figures spoke, its voice a rasping growl that sent vibrations through the air, as though its very words were tearing apart the space around them. You have been brought here to learn, to witness the consequences of your actions. David's breath hitched. Consequences? His mind raced, his thoughts spiraling, trying to grasp the meaning of the words. What did they mean by consequences? He had been poisoned. He had trusted Emma. He had loved her. He had never seen the betrayal coming. What had he done wrong? Why was he here? You failed to see, David. The voice came again, cold and condemning. You ignored the signs. You ignored the truth. You have done nothing but lie to yourself, to her, to everyone around you. David's knees buckled beneath him, and he fell to the ground, the weight of the figure's words crashing down on him like a wave. His mind reeled, the voices, the shadows, the accusations all blending together in a maddening cacophony. His chest heaved with the weight of the air around him, and for a moment he thought he might suffocate under the pressure. I didn't know. I didn't see. The words spilled from his lips, a desperate plea. I didn't know she would do this. I didn't see it coming. The figures moved closer, their glowing eyes burning into him, and one of them reached out with a long, skeletal hand, touching his forehead. The touch was cold, so cold it burned, and David's mind reeled, images flashing before his eyes. He saw everything: his life with Emma, their love, their marriage, the years they had spent together. But these images were warped, twisted. He saw the small, insignificant moments when things hadn't felt right, the subtle shifts, the coldness that had crept into her eyes, the way she had become distant, the way she had stopped caring. And then the last image came, the moment when she had poisoned him, the moment she had sealed his fate. The glass of wine, the way her hands had trembled slightly as she poured it, the way her smile had faltered for just a second before she handed it to him. It had all been there, all of the signs, and yet he had ignored them. He had chosen not to see. He had trusted her completely, never suspecting that she would betray him in the most horrific way possible. The figure's voice returned, cutting through the storm of memories that had engulfed his mind. You have known the truth all along, David, but you have ignored it. Your blindness to your own reality is what brought you here. It is what brought you to this place. David's heart was pounding now, his pulse hammering in his ears as the reality of it all sank in. He had known. He had felt the distance, the change in Emma. He had ignored the warning signs. He had chosen to ignore them. But now you must face it. The figure continued, its voice carrying a finality that made David's stomach drop. There is no escaping your own actions. No hiding from what you have done. David's mind began to spiral again, his chest tight with the suffocating weight of guilt and fear. He had thought death would bring him peace, bring an end to everything, but now it seemed that death was just another beginning, another trap, another layer of torment that he could never escape. And still there was no answer, no resolution, no way forward, only the presence of the figures, their cold eyes watching him, waiting for him to understand. David's heart raced, a frantic drumbeat in his chest that echoed through his entire being. The air was thick, suffocating, each breath feeling like it might be his last, and yet the suffocating weight of the presence around him wouldn't allow him to breathe freely. It was as though the very air had turned to molasses, sticky and cold, pressing down on him from all directions. The figures closed in, their form only half visible in the oppressive darkness, shadows stretching long and unnaturally in every direction. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness like fiery coals, watching him with an almost predatory intensity. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, the very floor feeling alive, as though it were something more than solid ground. It was as though the space around him were breathing, expanding and contracting, alive with some malevolent force that refused to release him. David tried to move, but his body was unresponsive, frozen in place by the paralyzing terror that gripped his heart. His legs felt as though they were anchored to the floor, his limbs too heavy to lift, his entire body imprisoned in a nightmarish stillness. Panic rose, clawing at his throat, but it was like trying to scream underwater. His voice barely came out as a weak rasp. "You cannot escape, David." The voice, that deep, ethereal presence, boomed in his mind, filling his ears with its force. "There is nowhere to run. You have entered the place between, and here, you are trapped." David's mind reeled. Trapped? He had to be dreaming. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the more he struggled, the more he realized there was no way out. There was no escape. The figures around him were closing in like wolves circling their prey, and each one of them moved with slow, deliberate steps that seemed to take an eternity to cross the space between them. He could feel their presence drawing near, a suffocating weight pushing against his chest. He tried to turn his head, to focus his eyes elsewhere, but his vision blurred. The shadows were everywhere now, crawling along the edges of his sight like creeping tendrils, reaching toward him from every corner. They whispered, their voices indistinguishable but growing louder with every passing second. They were not speaking to him, not in the way humans speak. No, these whispers were the language of the beyond, of ancient, forgotten horrors that transcended time and reason. They were trying to break through his consciousness, clawing at his sanity, making him question everything he thought he knew about life, about himself. "You chose this path, David?" The voice growled, and the temperature in the room plummeted, a chill that sank deep into his bones. He felt it in the marrow of his soul, an icy grip that slowly began to freeze him from the inside out. "You ignored the warnings. You ignored the signs. You sealed your fate long before you took the poison." His stomach churned, the feeling of nausea overwhelming him, as if the very words were infecting him, spreading through his mind like the poison he had swallowed in life. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, held in place by something invisible, something far more powerful than any of his physical limitations. The floor beneath him rumbled, a deep vibration that came from the ground itself, and David's eyes shot wide open as the shadows around him began to take shape. The figures were no longer distant, no longer just a dark presence. They were coming closer now, stepping out from the abyss, their forms becoming more defined, more menacing with each passing second. "Please, please no," David whispered, his voice trembling with fear, a thin thread of desperation. But the figures didn't respond. Instead, one of them stepped forward, towering over him. Its shape was almost human, but its skin was the color of shadows, dark, shifting, like liquid night. Its eyes burned with a fiery intensity that made David feel as though his very soul was being consumed, stripped bare under the weight of its gaze. "You knew this would happen, David." The voice wasn't the one he had heard before. This voice was colder, more sinister. "You knew the consequences of your actions. The lies, the betrayal, they have all led you here. You cannot hide from what you've done." David's chest tightened painfully as the figure's hand reached toward him. He couldn't move. He couldn't even blink. The hand was skeletal, bony, its fingers long and sharp like talons that could tear through him in an instant. But it wasn't the hand that terrified him, it was the presence that came with it. It was as though the figure wasn't just in the room with him. It was in him, consuming him, pulling him into its own darkness. "No," David gasped, barely able to speak as his chest tightened with fear. "No, I didn't mean to. You chose this, David." The figure's voice was more forceful now, its words like cold steel, driving into his mind, hammering him with the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. "You allowed yourself to be consumed by the same poison that killed you. You were blind to the truth. You ignored the love, the warning, and now you are here. Forever. David's heart pounded painfully in his chest. His body, frozen in terror, seemed to be unraveling from the inside out. The truth was so overwhelming that it felt as though his mind might split in two. He had seen the signs, the subtle cracks in his marriage with Emma, the way her eyes had changed, the way she had distanced herself from him. He had ignored them, chosen to believe in the facade of his life, believing that everything would be okay. But it wasn't. It had never been okay. The figure's fingers finally brushed against his skin, and the touch was colder than ice. David's body reacted with an involuntary shudder, a wave of horror sweeping through him. He felt his very soul being torn apart as the figure's hand closed around his throat, its grip tightening with unnatural strength. The world around him began to blur again, the shadows swallowing everything in its wake. And then, with a suddenness that took his breath away, the ground beneath him began to crack. David's vision was a chaotic blur as the darkness around him deepened, twisting, coiling, and turning into something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The figure's grip on his throat tightened, each pulse of pressure choking the air from his lungs. He tried to gasp for breath, but his throat was constricted, his chest aching as though his very life force was being squeezed out of him. The ground beneath him began to tremble, the vibrations crawling up his legs and into his chest, as if the earth itself were alive with rage, with hunger. A deep rumbling noise filled the air, the sound growing louder by the second, like the growl of a massive, unseen predator. The shadows around him seemed to suck the light from the room, plunging him deeper into an oppressive void where there was no escape, no relief. The world around him wasn't just dark now, it was alive. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the floor buckling beneath his feet as if the very space he stood in was morphing, changing, becoming something far more sinister. "You still don't understand, do you, David?" The voice was cold, dripping with malevolent glee. The figure's grip on his throat remained unrelenting as its words echoed in his mind. "You think you can escape this? You think you can run away from your own sins?" David's pulse pounded in his ears, the sound deafening as the room continued to shake. His entire body was racked with pain, his every nerve firing as if his very existence were being ripped apart at the seams. The pressure around his throat was so intense that it felt like his skull might crack from the strain, his vision narrowing as the world began to close in around him. He tried to scream, tried to beg for mercy, but no words came. His mouth was dry, his tongue thick and uncooperative. The darkness pressed in closer, the air now suffocating, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something far more putrid, like the very breath of death itself. And then, out of the corner of his eye, David saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was not the same as the others. This one was different. It was taller, its body more defined, its presence overwhelming. The very air seemed to part around it as it stepped forward, a dark, writhing mass of shadows, its eyes glowing with a fiery red intensity that seemed to burn right through David. "You have been judged, David." The voice was deep, rumbling like thunder, and as it spoke, the ground cracked open beneath his feet, splitting wide open, revealing a chasm that seemed to stretch down into the very bowels of hell itself. "You have failed, and now, you will bear the weight of your mistakes for eternity." David's breath caught in his throat as the ground shifted again. This wasn't just some dark, twisted place. It was something else. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the very weight of his soul being dragged toward the chasm that had opened beneath him. The dark figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, filling him with a terror so primal that it felt as though his very heart would stop from the sheer force of it. "You chose her." The figure's voice hissed, the words sliding into David's mind like a venomous serpent. "You chose to ignore the truth. You chose to remain blind to her darkness, to her poison." David's mind reeled. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and fear. What was this? Was this his fate? Was this the price of his ignorance? Was this his punishment for loving Emma? But the figure didn't give him time to think. With a sudden jerk, it reached out, and the world around David shattered like glass, splintering apart in every direction. His body was pulled into the void, dragged through an abyss that defied all logic. The air was thick with something foul, something so putrid that he could taste it in his mouth. The darkness was overwhelming, and yet, it was alive. He could feel it pulsing with each beat of his heart, a living, breathing force that was wrapping around him, tightening its grip, pulling him deeper into its cold embrace. His mind fractured as he was yanked through time and space, his body twisting and distorting in ways that felt unnatural. Each second was an eternity as the pressure mounted, as the weight of everything he had done, the lies, the betrayal, crushed him further. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness stopped. David was no longer in the void. He was somewhere else now. He couldn't tell where he was, couldn't tell if this place was real or if it was another part of the nightmare that had begun the moment he died. His surroundings were shifting, fluid, constantly changing, as though they couldn't decide where to settle. Everything around him was flickering in and out of focus, like a broken television screen. But there was something else. Something that felt worse than the darkness. He was not alone. The figures had followed him. One by one, they materialized, stepping out from the shadows with slow, deliberate movements, their eyes locked onto him. Their forms were twisting, bending unnaturally, like the very fabric of reality couldn't hold them. Each one of them was different, yet all of them exuded the same malevolent presence. The air grew thicker with each passing second, the weight of their gaze suffocating him. "You cannot run, David." The voice that had spoken earlier was now a chorus of whispers, each one cutting through his mind like knives. "You are ours now. You belong to the void." David's blood ran cold, and his chest tightened with an unbearable sense of dread. He couldn't see them fully, couldn't fully understand what they were, but he could feel it. They were closing in on him, inching closer with each second, their hands outstretched, their fingers curling like claws. The room around him began to fade again, the walls bending and warping, as though the very reality he was trapped in was collapsing in on itself. "No, no," David shouted, his voice breaking. "I didn't do anything wrong." But his words had no power here, no meaning. The shadows didn't care. The figures closed in, and David realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The darkness wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it had consumed him. And with that final realization, the shadows closed around him completely, swallowing him whole. David's body jerked as the darkness swallowed him whole, pulling him into a void that stretched infinitely. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as his surroundings twisted and warped, the very fabric of reality warping into something far worse than his mind could comprehend. His body felt like it was being pulled in every direction at once, as if he were being torn apart piece by piece, his limbs stretching and contracting, as though his very essence was being torn from his soul. The world around him was no longer just a swirling abyss. It was something more, something alive. He could feel it pressing against him, could feel the weight of the shadows closing in, suffocating him. Every step he took was met with resistance, as though the very air was fighting against him, trapping him in a nightmare that he couldn't escape. And still, the figures from before, those terrifying, inhuman beings, stood at the edges of his vision, watching him, waiting for something. But it wasn't just the figures that filled him with dread now. It was the presence that had been watching him ever since he died, that had invaded his thoughts, his mind, turning everything he had known into a sickening, twisted version of reality. And then, as if sensing his growing terror, the presence spoke. "You cannot escape this, David." The words didn't come from the figures. They didn't come from any source he could see. They echoed through his mind, like a command, a forceful, unyielding truth. It was everywhere. Inside him, around him, overwhelming him. David's legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, his chest tight with panic. His heart pounded violently in his chest, each beat a reminder that something was coming for him. Something that had been waiting, watching, for him to understand, to face the truth. "You are here because of your own choices, David." The voice was cold, empty of any sympathy or remorse. "You made your bed, and now you will lie in it. There is no escape from what is to come." David's mind reeled, trying to cling to some fragment of rational thought, trying to make sense of what was happening. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be here in this dark, suffocating place. He hadn't deserved this. The voice's words were a nightmare, but the worst part, the part that gnawed at his very soul, was that they were true. He had known. He had felt the change in Emma, the poison that had crept into their lives, both literal and emotional. She had turned on him, betrayed him, but he had known, he had seen the signs. He had let it happen. He had chosen to turn a blind eye, to ignore the growing darkness in their relationship. And now, the consequences of his apathy were clear. You allowed her to poison you, David. You allowed her to destroy everything you built. The voice came again, louder this time, more forceful. Your life, your love, your choices, everything was a lie. And now, you will face the consequences. David's heart felt like it was being crushed in his chest, the weight of the voice's words pressing down on him. His mind began to fracture as the truth of it all finally sank in, and the crushing realization that he had sealed his fate with his own blindness swept over him like a flood. He had chosen to ignore it. He had seen the warning signs, the distance between them, the coldness in her eyes, the subtle manipulation. He had felt it deep in his gut. But he had refused to acknowledge it, choosing to trust the lies, choosing to believe that everything would be okay. And now, this was his punishment. The figures surrounding him grew more defined, stepping closer, their forms becoming more tangible, their eyes gleaming with an eerie, predatory gleam. They were no longer just dark silhouettes. They were real as the terror that now consumed him. You thought you could escape the truth, but you were wrong. One of the figures stepped forward, its form twisted, its face obscured by darkness. Its voice was a low growl vibrating through the air. You were the architect of your own demise, David. And now, there is no going back. David's stomach churned with guilt, with horror. He could feel the weight of the figure's gaze as it locked onto him, as if it could see into the very core of his being. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream. But his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed by the suffocating presence of the figures around him, the oppressive force that had him trapped in this nightmare. The ground beneath him began to crack open, the earth splitting apart as the chasm widened. The shadows rose from the cracks like black tendrils, slithering up his legs, pulling at him. He could feel the cold fingers of darkness wrapping around him, dragging him toward the abyss that yawned before him. The chasm was real. He could feel the heat emanating from it, the suffocating heat that promised nothing but suffering. You failed her. You failed yourself. The voice whispered again, the words seeping into his mind like venom. And now you will suffer for it, forever. David's throat tightened with a scream he couldn't release, his body trembling as the figures stepped closer, their faces now visible, ghastly, deformed shapes with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to burn with an insatiable hunger. They were closing in on him, surrounding him, their dark hands reaching out, their fingers like sharp claws, ready to drag him into the void. But then, amidst the oppressive dark, David heard something else. A distant sound, so faint, so fleeting, that for a moment he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. It was a whisper. A voice he knew. David. The sound of his name, spoken so gently, sent a wave of shock through his chest. His head snapped toward the sound, his heart racing, his breath shallow. There, in the distance, standing alone at the edge of the chasm, was her. But something was wrong. She was different. Her eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, her face twisted in an expression of regret, of sorrow, but also of something much darker. A shadow seemed to cling to her, as if she were not just part of the darkness, but one with it. David opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, the shadow of Emma began to move, her face slowly distorting as she stepped closer, closer to the void, closer to the figures that surrounded him. And with each step she took, David felt his body weakening further. The very sight of her, her betrayal so real, so tangible, felt like an anchor pulling him into the depths. You can't escape her, David, the voice of the figure said, its tone full of finality. She has already claimed you. David felt his body sinking into the abyss, the coldness of the chasm pulling at him, dragging him toward its depths. His vision blurred as the figures continued to encircle him, their cold hands reaching out, their eyes burning with the same merciless hunger. The suffocating presence of the shadows closed in tighter, like a vice around his chest. His breath was shallow, each inhale a battle, each exhale an effort to stave off the terror clawing at his throat. And then, there was her voice again. David. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakably Emma's. It called to him from the darkness, distant and yet so close, reverberating in his mind, gnawing at him with every passing second. He could feel the weight of her presence, but it wasn't the same Emma he had known. This was different. This wasn't the woman he had loved. This was something twisted, something malevolent. "I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you, but," Emma's voice faltered, and for a split second, David felt the stirrings of hope. Was she truly apologizing? Could this all just be some terrible misunderstanding? Was there some way for him to make peace with her, to forgive her? But as quickly as it came, the hope faded, replaced with a sense of overwhelming dread. The distorted figure that stood in the distance wasn't just a shade of Emma. It was her, but something far worse. Her face twisted with a horrific smile, one that was too wide, too filled with malice. Her eyes, once filled with love, were now black voids, swirling with shadows that seemed to consume her whole. "You never knew me, David." Her voice came again, cold and distant. "You never knew what I truly was." Suddenly, everything shifted. The figures surrounding David dissolved into shadows, their forms dissipating into nothingness as though they were smoke. The ground beneath his feet began to crumble, but instead of sinking deeper into the chasm, David was thrust upward, back into the swirling void that surrounded him. The air around him flickered like a broken film reel, changing, distorting. And in that moment, David felt as though time itself was warping, bending at impossible angles, until everything snapped into a new reality. His eyes widened as the world shifted, and there, standing before him, was Emma. But not Emma. This wasn't the wife he had known. This was a woman who was somehow different. Her features were sharper, her eyes gleaming with a knowing darkness, and her posture radiated a terrifying power he had never seen in her before. "You were right to doubt me, David." Her voice was deeper now, more guttural, like a voice that had lived in the shadows far longer than she ever had. "But you never suspected the truth, did you?" David felt a sinking sensation in his stomach, as though the very air around him was about to collapse in on him. He tried to move, to scream, but his voice was gone. His body felt like it was made of lead, too heavy to lift. All he could do was stand there and stare as the woman who had once been his wife took another step forward, her presence now suffocating, overwhelming. "You should have known the truth, David." The woman smiled, her teeth now unnaturally sharp, glinting in the dim light. "I never poisoned you." David froze. "What? You did?" The figure stepped closer, its grin widening. "You were always the poison. You have always been the one who held the darkness inside of you, David." David's blood ran cold. The room around him began to spin, the reality he had clung to unraveling at an impossible rate. What do you mean?" His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was enough to fuel the figure's cruel amusement. "You don't remember, do you?" She laughed, the sound echoing through the endless void. "The poison was never in the wine, David. The poison was in your mind, in your soul. You created your own misery. You allowed yourself to drown in guilt, in rage. I was merely a vessel for your punishment." The air around him thickened with a burning heat, suffocating his lungs. This couldn't be happening. He was already dead. He had been poisoned. He had died because of her. His mind raced with the impossible contradictions, the horrifying reality of what he was hearing. "The poison, David, is in your heart. It always has been." The figure's eyes glowed bright red now, the shadows around her twisting and warping, swirling like a storm. "You've poisoned everyone you've touched, and now you've poisoned yourself." David stumbled back, his mind reeling, trying to process the flood of new information. His wife, his Emma, hadn't killed him. She had become the reflection of his own guilt, his own choices. But how could that be? He had seen her serve him the poisoned wine. He had seen her hands tremble. "You never saw it, David." The figure's voice shifted again, softer now, almost pitying. "The wine was never the cause. The cause was always you, your failure to see the truth." Suddenly, the world around him snapped back into focus. The void was gone, replaced by a place that felt too real, too grounded. David found himself standing in a hallway, dimly lit, with walls that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. "What is this? Where am I?" His voice echoed through the empty space, the silence deafening. The figure, Emma, was gone, but the weight of her words remained, wrapping around his mind like chains, dragging him deeper into the truth he couldn't bear to face. And then it happened. The shadows in the hallway shifted, forming into a new shape. It was a figure, someone David had never expected to see here. His heart lurched as the figure materialized, standing in front of him, as familiar as the breath in his lungs. It was his father, but his father had been dead for years. "Dad?" David whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" His father's face was serene, calm, but there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness, that unsettled David to his core. "David," his father spoke softly, his voice filled with a strange, distant sorrow. "You've been given a choice. A choice to leave this place, but only if you can face what you've done. You will never be free of your guilt, David, not until you understand. Not until you face the poison inside you." David's mind spun. His father, standing before him, the one figure he thought he could never face in this realm, was telling him the same thing the voice had said. His choices, his blindness, had led him here, into a dark world where he was forced to confront the truth. But then, his father said the final words that shattered everything. "You were never poisoned, David. You poisoned me." David stood in the silence of his own soul, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. He had poisoned them all, the people he loved, the ones who trusted him. He had lived a life of avoidance, of self-deceit, refusing to see the cracks that had formed in his relationships. The guilt, the darkness, it had consumed him, poisoning his very existence long before Emma ever poured that glass of wine. His father's face faded into the void, his voice lingering in David's mind like an echo of the past. "You poisoned me, David." The darkness around him shifted, morphing into something different. No longer oppressive, it became a space of understanding. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about confronting the truth, acknowledging the mistakes that had led him to this place. In this moment of reckoning, David realized that his afterlife wasn't about escape, it was about redemption. There would be no escape from the truth, no leaving until he understood. But understanding meant he could change, evolve, and, in a way, heal. He could finally let go of the poison that had shackled him for so long.